begin the program, I want to acknowledge that here at MOHAI, we are on the historic and contemporary lands and waters of the Duwamish, Suquamish, Muckleshoot, and all Coast Salish people. Historically, Native communities were forcibly removed from this city, but today we honor their continued endurance with deep respect and gratitude for their unbroken stewardship of this place. We will dive more deeply into this history tonight, but I also encourage you to visit the websites of local tribes to learn more about whose land you are on. So tonight is our Denny Lecture. It's named in honor of Seattle's Denny family, and we're so honored to have Maria Denny here as president of MOHAI's Board of Trustees. In addition to serving on MOHAI's board for 8 years, Maria has also been involved in many cultural, arts, and environmental organizations, both as a professional and community volunteer. So to introduce our speaker tonight, I'm going to turn it over to Maria Denny. Thank you.
Good evening. The Denny Lecture presents the very best in regional historical scholarship, recognizing an individual who is making a difference in the community and beyond through an exploration of history. This year, in honor of our upcoming exhibits, Ansel Adams' Masterworks and Perspectives on Place, Photographs from Here, we wanted to choose a speaker who was also exploring the relationships between humans and place. We are so pleased tonight to have the honor of welcoming BJ Cummings to this year's Denny Lecture. I first knew of BJ back in the 1990s when she worked for the Puget Soundkeeper Alliance, where her title was the Soundkeeper. I always thought that was such a wonderful and very fitting title for her. From there, BJ went on to author the award-winning book, The River That Made Seattle, a human and natural history of the Duwamish. She founded the Duwamish River Cleanup Coalition in 2001 and currently manages community engagement in environmental health research for the University of Washington School of Public Health. Please join me in welcoming BJ Cummings.
Hi, thank you. I will adjust the mic while describing myself as a particularly short, middle-aged white woman with slowly darkening blondish hair. Okay, so thank you so much for welcoming me here today. And I want to especially extend my personal gratitude to James Rasmussen, who is here with us tonight, for working with me, James, to unravel and co-curate the Duwamish tribal family histories that are included in the river that made Seattle, and also my acknowledgement to all members of the Duwamish tribe, past, present, and future, for hosting all of us here in the greater Seattle area on their traditional lands. Thank you. So I want to jump right in by taking you all on a quick animated tour through just one small slice of the history of our shared Duwamish watershed. We're going to do this as a little Google Earth video, and I'll describe what we're seeing as we go. Excellent. And let's press start. We're going to begin our tour of the Duwamish River from its historic source on Mount Rainier. The farthest reaching branch of the historic Duwamish River watershed originates from the ice caves at the base of Mount Rainier's Emmons Glacier at an elevation of about 5,000 feet. This is the origin of the White River, which was later severed from and redirected away from the Duwamish watershed. The White River flows from the ice caves buried under rock debris from a 1963 avalanche that now covers the lower portion of the glacier, and it cascades down Mount Rainier to the junction with the Greenwater River in the small town of Greenwater. The Greenwater River itself originates at Natchez Pass, where the colonists' very first wagon trains crossed the Cascade Range. The river then continues to flow west, past Muckleshoot Prairie, to the current city of Auburn, where it was diverted south, away from the farmland that once lined the river's floodplains by early settler farmers armed with dynamite, who blasted a new path for the river. It now flows down the narrow Stuck Valley to the Puyallup River and into Puget Sound at Commencement Bay, about 10 miles away. Following the White River's original path through the now dry city of Auburn, we come to the historic junction with the Green River, which once flowed into the White here as one of several river branches comprising the original watershed. Today, the Green is the only surviving branch feeding the Duwamish, and on its course north towards Seattle, the river passes through an original settlement called White River on its way to its confluence with another lost branch of the watershed. The Black River was diverted in the early 1900s when a ship canal was cut into the large lake that used to drain to the Duwamish River through the Black. Lake Washington now flows through the new ship canal into Puget Sound 15 miles north, which caused the Black River to dry up completely. The only water that enters the Duwamish here today comes from a few remaining wetlands and the occasional overflow from the Renton sewage treatment plant. Below this point, the river is called the Duwamish. 5 miles on, we meet the beginning of a constructed canal that replaced the river's original meanders. Built to accommodate industrial expansion and completed in 1920, the canal runs past the historic neighborhood of South Park. Uh-oh. Sorry, 1 second. Live event's great. Okay. So, where were we? So we're on the Duwamish. Can we get it started again? Press play?
It's going.
Yeah, I'm just waiting for it to start moving. Thank you. Okay, so across the river from South Park is Boeing's plant number 2, which you can see in the foreground here. And on the same side of the river as Boeing, the industrial residential fence line community of Georgetown is where Seattle's very first white settlers claimed land on the banks of the river in the midst of dozens of the Duwamish tribe's log houses. Only one original riverbend remains on the lower Duwamish River at the historic Duwamish village of Uliquat. Here, the discovery of a prehistoric tribal village in the 1970s stopped the Port of Seattle from filling in the river's last bend in order to build one more marine terminal. This used to be the mouth of the river, opening up onto open water and tide flats. All of the land downriver of Uliquat is constructed land built for shipping and industry. The island in the center of the historic estuary is Harbor Island, which was the largest man-made island in the world at the time that it was built. And on the far side of Harbor Island, the Duwamish enters Elliott Bay in Puget Sound on the downtown Seattle waterfront. This is just a snapshot of one portion of the historic Duwamish watershed, including the city it has gained and what it has lost. The changes to the White River subbasin of the watershed, while really dramatic, don't reflect the only or even the most significant change that's been made to our watershed, only one of its earliest. So next we're going to look more closely at some of the other changes that the early colonial immigrants brought to the watershed as they began to settle here in the mid-1800s. Let's go on back to the slideshow. Wonderful. So what we're seeing here is a map of the Duwamish watershed from the 1800s. In the upper right corner of this map is a legend saying that this is showing all of King County, and the date is 1888. And on the map, the different branches of the Duwamish River watershed are highlighted in blue. As you can see on the map, the Duwamish watershed occupied almost all of the county at that time. And I want to just, for quick orientation, right up in the upper left corner is the city of Seattle. This is Puget Sound to the left of it, Lake Washington behind Seattle to the right. There are 4 main branches to the original watershed. The southernmost being the White River branch, where we just visited, where it began on Google Earth, just off the map here. The middle branch being the Green River branch, and the northern branch being the Cedar River branch. In addition, all of Lake Sammamish, the river connecting Lake Sammamish to Lake Washington, and all of Lake Washington and its tributaries, which at the time even included Green Lake up here in North Seattle, connect with the Cedar and drain out through the Black River to join the flow of the Green and the White. And everything downriver of that is what we call the Duwamish. In the southern part of the watershed, the White River was diverted to the Puyallup Basin in Commencement Bay via that narrow Stuck Valley in 1898. This diversion was aided by those flood-weary farmers armed with dynamite that I mentioned on our virtual tour. The change isn't quite what they had hoped to accomplish. A log jam on the White had caused backed up water from the White River to overflow a little narrow isthmus between the Stuck River Valley and the White River Valley, and set the White River floodwaters into the Stuck Valley. Trying to clear that jam, this group of southern farmers dynamited the river, but rather than clearing the jam, the explosion brought a high bluff of mud and debris down on top of the log pile instead, which just solidified the blockage it was causing. So more of the White River's floodwater was then forced down the Stuck Channel, and the force of that water carved a path across the narrow barrier and split the river's flow. So with this new gouge, the next big flood had an easier path into the Stuck Valley. And I want to read you a brief description from the book about what happened during that time. In late November 1906, William Hempel was patrolling the bank of the White River, rifle at his side, as a defense against angry farmers hired from the south. An itinerant day laborer and miner, this week, Hempel himself was a hired gun, one of several who had been sent by the King County Sheriff to keep watch over the river. Just a week earlier, the flooding river had spanned a width of 3 miles. In the last few days, between the town of Slaughter, now Auburn, and the Muckleshoot Indian Reservation, the river had run dry. Its waters had all turned south into the small Stuck River Channel and the Puyallup Basin below. The volume of water overwhelmed the narrow Stuck Valley, sweeping away homes, roads, and bridges. The diversion drained the White River floodwaters, revealing a massive logjam that forced the river to jump its banks again and carve a new channel. This time, King County sent a squad of armed guards to ensure that the Pierce County farmers now in the path of the flood wouldn't dynamite the riverbank to force the water back. The new course of the White River suited King County and its farmers just fine. In flood stage, the White River was a destructive force that nobody wanted. So soon after this, some more intentional new channels would also be constructed elsewhere in the watershed, but this diversion eliminated the river through the town that we now know as Auburn. In 1912, the Cedar River was then channelized into Lake Washington to route its floodwaters around the growing town of Renton. But soon after, both the river and the lakes were further diverted via a new channel cut from Lake Washington out to Lake Union and then all the way out to Puget Sound in 1916. With this new shipping canal, Lake Washington dropped by 7 feet below the level of its outlet to the Black River, which then dried up entirely. With these cuts, only the Green River remained to feed the Duwamish, and the original watershed was reduced to just a quarter of its original size. Changes on the remaining Duwamish River were also underway during this time. Beginning in 1895, industrialists began transforming the open bay at the mouth of the river. This photo shows early years of building out industrial corridors and rail lines built by the boosters who began to use the tidal mudflats to suspend elevated transportation corridors and even build factory islands in the middle of the bay. They considered the mudflats worthless and even pestilent. One of those early industrialists, a man named Eugene Semple, created Harbor Island and its flanking canals. And he boasted about his work in writing, saying, quote, "On this land will be founded the major portion of the manufacturing industries of the city by making solid and substantial land where formerly there was only water, the rising and falling of the tides, and occasionally bare and unsightly mudflats, which were a menace to the health of the dwellers on the adjacent dry lands." So Semple certainly delivered on his promise. This photo of today's filled and developed Soto, Harbor Island, and West Seattle Marine Terminals are a testament to his vision. Same place. Next, we're going to look at a historic map of the original meandering course of the Duwamish River below its historic Black River junction. Following the filling of the tide flats, a plan was developed to straighten the meanders in this portion of the Duwamish River and fill them in with more dry land in order to expand industry into Seattle's only flat basin, the Duwamish River Valley. I also want you to watch the spot on the map marked by a star, where the river enters the mudflats and open water of the bay. This is the location of the Duwamish tribe's fishing village of Uliquat that we mentioned during the Google Earth tour. As the canal was dug, the straightened waterway and the original river meanders coexisted for a very brief period, but that coexistence of the old and the new was very short-lived. And the location of that star that we saw at the mouth of the river on the original map is now completely surrounded by dry land, as both the river and the bay were filled in and developed. This next photo is an aerial that shows the same snapshot of time when the constructed canal and the original river bends coexisted. And again, the star on the map where the river originally entered the bay at Uliquat. Following the construction of the canal, 12 miles of the lower Duwamish River had been straightened to a short 5-mile shipping canal. Only one original river bend remains at the Duwamish tribe's historic village of Uliquat. This overlay map shows its location relative to both the original river course, which you can see in gray, and the constructed waterway, industrial lands, and Harbor Island that we have there today. And again, the star. And finally, a contemporary photo of that remaining river bend and the location of Uliquat. Once at the mouth of the river delta, this bend is now a full mile upriver of the constructed end of the shipping canal and its surrounding built-up industrial lands. So, looking at this river bend here, I want to read you one more short excerpt from the book about how this singular remaining river bend came to be. A bulldozer was churning up the ground where Cecile Maxwell's ancestral village had once stood. Maxwell, the great-grandniece of Chief Seattle and the new chairwoman of the Duwamish tribe, had been visiting the site upriver of the West Seattle Bridge often. In the months leading up to this day, in early July 1976, she had frequently talked with the archaeology students, sifting through carefully excavated bores of black dirt speckled with shell and bone fragments. She was eager to learn about their finds and how they might affect her tribe's claims to land and fishing rights in the area. No students were working, their project had been wrapped up, the grids and tools they'd been using in their research removed. The site had been quiet for several weeks, but today, a bulldozer was working the area where the students had meticulously documented fragments of bone, stone tools, and seashell deposits. Alarmed, Maxwell hurried back to her office and dialed the number for the Army Corps of Engineers. The previous fall, Maxwell had received a letter notifying her that the Army Corps had found evidence of a tribal settlement on land owned by the Port of Seattle. The Corps' district archaeologist, David Munsell, had been reviewing an application from the port for a permit to fill a river bend that was left behind when the Duwamish waterway was constructed more than half a century earlier. The remnant branched sharply off the deep, straight shipping channel and looped west before arcing back to rejoin the constructed waterway half a mile downriver, or a full mile following along the meander formed by the natural riverbed. The port's permit application was routine, but a new Washington state law declared a state interest in protecting archaeological resources for their historic and scientific value. The Corps of Engineers had never examined any Duwamish River sites for their archaeological value before, but the port's Terminal 107 property, which sat along the remnant stretch of river, was right across the channel from Munsell's office. He could see it from the windows of the Army Corps building. So, with the application in hand, he drove across the West Seattle Bridge to take a look. Munsell passed the Seaboard Lumber Mill before turning into a small lot at Terminal 107. He parked his car and walked to a cluster of houses in the process of being demolished. To prepare for developing the property, the port was evicting the occupants of an entire neighborhood of modest homes that stretched along the riverbend. Some of the houses had already been removed, their shallow foundation pits exposed. Peering down at the exposed layers of earth in one of the pits, Munsell immediately knew that he would not be approving the port's application. A swath of exposed shell and bone fragments more than a foot deep cut across the face of the dirt, a classic midden or disposal ground of a type commonly associated with prehistoric villages. The Port of Seattle's Terminal 107 had archaeological resources in abundance, lying bare for all to see. So it was here, at this riverbend, that the Duwamish tribal chairwoman encountered the bulldozer in 1976. And here that the early American settlers built a bustling neighborhood of gridded streets and fishing docks in the 1890s. And here that the Duwamish tribe had lived in a cluster of longhouses and hosted potlatches for over 1,000 years. Maxwell's intervention with the bulldozer saved the last remaining natural riverbend on the lower Duwamish River. And today, it's a protected park that sits across the road from the Duwamish tribe's newly built longhouse and cultural center at the location of their historic village. And both the park and the longhouse are open to the public and a great place to get acquainted with the history of our river and its indigenous people. So, of course, Uliquat was only one of hundreds of culturally significant sites in the Duwamish watershed. This is a small excerpt of a map created by Amir Sheikh for Carl Thrush's book, Native Seattle. It shows the location of Duwamish villages in red and other important landmarks in the black dots. Along the lower Duwamish River alone, there were 15 longhouses distributed among 5 villages, and there were at least 90 longhouses in the greater Duwamish watershed, housing an estimated 10,000 people. During the time that the ambitious engineering changes that we've just seen were happening in the watershed, it's important to remember that equally dramatic changes were taking place among the river's indigenous people. White colonial settlement was turning the watershed's social landscape upside down. So I want to introduce next one of the indigenous families who kept meticulous records of what happened to them in the 7 generations that have passed since white settlement and how they survived that transition. A couple of decades before the first settler put down roots in the current city of Seattle, when the Maples, Collins, and Van Asselt families claimed land on the banks of the Duwamish River in 1851 before the arrival of the Denny Party, a man named Skabald, who's pictured here, squatting at the base of a tree in his elder years, and his sister, Tukt Alyut, were born to a Black River family in the village of Spabadin. They were highborn, or among the leadership class of the region's indigenous people, and Sabald became a healer. His sister married Chris Canham. Canaan was a Skagit chief from Whidbey Island who was an ally of Chief South and signed the Treaty of Point Elliott alongside him. Canaan and Tukdaliut had 2 daughters, and Stabal became known as Dr. Jack or Uncle Jack to his family. Stabal never left the Duwamish watershed. This is a 1865 map showing the junction of the Black and Cedar Rivers just below Lake Washington. On the left is the Black River settlement. Right here, it's a little difficult to see the outline, but right here, that many Duwamish people from the area of Spavadid continued to occupy. Far to the right, on this, whoops, excuse me. Uh-oh. No, it's not going backwards. Thank you. Can you take off one more? Perfect. Okay, there we go. To the right, there's another little square here. Hopefully you can see it. It's a little difficult, my apologies. Is where Dr. Jack eventually moved, just far enough up the Cedar River to get away from the increasing numbers of settlers moving into the growing town of Renton. And it was here that he continued to practice traditional medicine and host traditional gatherings, games, and ceremonies that were beginning to be outlawed by the settlers' colonial government. And his family still has some of the regalia from these ceremonies, such as the leather waist belt pictured here, which is adorned with beads, feathers, hair, and bone. Canaan and Tukdaliut's daughter, Keolitsa, moved back from Whidbey Island to her mother's ancestral village of Spavadid on the Black River. I'm having some more technical difficulties. Oh.
Are you trying to go forward?
No, there's a map. Is that showing on your screen? Because it's not showing up here. Okay. Well, that's interesting. What I will tell you, though, is that she moved from Whidbey Island back to her mother's village of Spavadid, which would be on the map if the map were there. It's on the Black River, and that happened just as the white pioneers were beginning to settle in her homelands. Her family's oral history says that she was then kidnapped and taken east of the mountains to the Yakama Nation, but later escaped using a canoe and paddle that she stole to make her way back home. She then married a white pioneer, a man named Dr. Reuben Bigelow, who opened the region's very first coal mine. The photo of her here in Western-style dress is likely from that time. Bigelow died a few years later, and Keolitsa, who adopted the name Anne, married another settler, Abner Tuttle. Tuttle worked in the lumber camps near Old Man House, where her father would have spent time visiting with Chief South. Census records show that if they married there, that they were married there, and that their first daughter was born near Salmon Bay, back on the west side of Puget Sound. They then moved and raised their family on Vashon Island, where their neighbors were other native families, Americans and Europeans, as well as Chinese, Hawaiians, and Africans. Vashon at that time had a world of immigrants etching out their living in farming and extractive industries. Abner Tuttle himself planted Vashon Island's very first apple orchard, which is still there today on the banks of Quartermaster Harbor. Later in life, after Keolitsa's children were grown, she made her way back to the Duwamish watershed, living with her husband, and then after Abner died, with her sister in Houghton, to the east of Lake Washington. And then she died in 1913 at her daughter's home on Beacon Hill, where this last photo, there we go, of her was taken, petting a deer on the porch of their family home. Keolitsa and Abner Tuttle's first daughter, Nellie, was among the Puget Sound area's first generation of mixed native settler children. The photo here shows her with her son, Myron Jr. As a teenager, Nellie returned from Vashon to the Seattle area and wound up working in the home of Judge Thomas Burke, an attorney and railroad booster whose name is memorialized in the Burke Building downtown, the Burke Museum at UW, and of course the Burke-Gilman Trail, which follows the course of the railroad that he helped build. During her time working in Burke's household, it seems that Nellie learned a great deal about the settlers' laws and land transactions. It's likely that she helped her Uncle Jack secure his homestead land claim on the Cedar River in the 1890s. It was the only such claim ever granted to a Duwamish person in their native homelands. Nellie's name started showing up on property deeds and tax records, like this one, as early as 1893. She and her sister inherited Uncle Jack's property when he passed away, and her name was on the deed for the land her parents and aunt lived on in Houghton. And it was her name that was on the early tax records for the homestead she and her husband bought on Beacon Hill. Duwamish women as 19th century land barons, right? I'm sure that's a whole nother book right there that hopefully somebody out there will write. Interestingly, the land that Nellie and her husband homesteaded was Washington State University land. Now, Thomas Burke had served on the University Board of Regents. Nellie's land sat squarely on top of the route that Burke's competitor for the construction of a ship canal planned to build through Beacon Hill. His competitor was Eugene Semple. The two were embroiled in a stiff and often nasty competition for financing of what were known as the proposed South and North Canal routes. Semple began to dig out Beacon Hill in pursuit of his southern canal, but he never got as far as Nellie's homestead. I suspect that if he had, Burke would have been there to defend his former employee against that encroachment. Possibly, he even had a hand, through his connection at the university, of securing that land in the path of Semple's canal. That's one of several mysteries that I and his family are continuing to try to unravel. Myron Jr. was raised on this homestead. He was a child when the Duwamish River was being straightened, when the level of Lake Washington dropped in view of his family home with the opening of Burke's North Canal, and when the tidelands that Semple filled in Elliott Bay were being turned into Seattle's industrial powerhouse. As an adult, he wound up being employed in one of Harbor Island's very first industries, a shipyard that was called Todd when he worked there, now known as Vigor. Myron Jr. was also a founding member of the new Duwamish Tribal Council, organized under the US laws that were required at that time in order to carry on their tribal governance. Despite intermarrying with new settler immigrants, his family was not abandoning their indigenous identity. To the contrary, they were securing their legal rights to remain in their ancestral homeland and to continue to exercise their tribal sovereignty in accordance with the rules and laws that were imposed by the colonial government. By the time Myron Jr. daughter's Anne was born, the Duwamish Watershed's transformation was complete, and the population of Seattle had exploded and diversified. She grew up during World War II and remembered their Beacon Hill neighbor, Tadashi Yamaguchi, being taken away in 1941 and interned along with the rest of his Japanese family. She raised her own son in the same house that her grandparents had built, and followed her father in serving on the Duwamish Tribal Council. And in the photo here, she's holding the canoe paddle that Keolitsa used to escape from her abduction by the Yakimas. This quote came from an interview that Anne gave for an oral history of her family in 1998. "I still have the paddle. When I touch it, I can feel her great strength and bravery." Anne's son, now, this is Chris Kanan and Tip Dalyute's great-great-great-grandson, James Rasmussen, was born in 1955. And I'll quote a description of him, of my own, as a young man from the book. 6 feet tall, James carried himself with pride. His brown hair was pulled back in a long ponytail. He sported a thick beard. He was a notable musician in Seattle's jazz scene, and at age 24 was following in the footsteps of his mother and grandfather on the Duwamish Tribal Council. James became instrumental in efforts to revitalize the river after a century of industrialization, environmental degradation, and increasing evidence of harmful health impacts suffered by the river's communities. His work lent momentum to efforts to add the Duwamish River to the National Superfund Site List, which requires the industries and others responsible for the contamination to pay for cleanup, restoration of habitat, and controls on ongoing sources of pollution. We're going to come back to James and his relationship with the river in a minute, but first, James's niece, his sister's daughter, Christine Nelson, is the 7th generation since Dr. Jack and his sister greeted the first white settlers to Puget Sound. She's also the 4th generation of his family to serve on the modern Duwamish Tribal Council. The changes this family has witnessed in the Duwamish watershed and the region are all documented in the river that made Seattle. And the family's adaptation and resilience through those changes is truly astounding. But they're not alone. Other descendants of Chris Canham and the descendants of Chief Self and many others are still with us, as are the descendants of those first settler families. Many of them are actively influencing the future of Seattle to this day. And this is certainly true of James Rasmussen. Just as his ancestors did, James had a way of forging alliances with people who are quite different from himself. So I want to briefly tell you one such story. In 1984, James met a man named John Beale. John was a Vietnam War veteran who moved to the Duwamish Valley in 1976. He suffered from PTSD, and at age 29, he had 3 heart attacks, and doctors diagnosed him as terminal, with maybe 6 months to live. His doctors recommended he find a hobby and a way to make peace with his fate. So John turned to the little semblance of nature that he could find in a deep ravine behind his house, with a murky stream and thick blackberry brambles and piles of trash. But grateful for the quiet refuge that it offered him in his illness, he resolved he was going to clean it up. He wanted to leave his little patch of nature better than he'd found it. He succeeded, and much of his story has now been told around the world, in part because he also lived for another 30 years. The part of the story that is much less known is the relationship between James and John. In 1984, John Beale approached the Duwamish tribe to ask for their help restoring salmon runs in the Duwamish River and its little tributary, his creek, called Ham Creek in West Seattle's South Park neighborhood. As the council heard him out, James was particularly impressed with John's passion for the river. The two formed a partnership that would help transform both the creek and the Duwamish River over the next 2 decades. They worked together to focus attention on the river that had sustained James's family for generations, and the creek that John credited with keeping him alive. In 1990, they gained the support of the City of Seattle and King County to launch a public-private partnership called the Green Duwamish Watershed Alliance. And then in 2000, they recruited a broad-based coalition of Native, environmental, social justice, and neighborhood groups to create an organization called the Duwamish River Cleanup Coalition. By the time EPA listed the river for Superfund cleanup in 2001, James and John were poised and ready to lead the charge for a river revival that would protect the health of all of the river's Native and immigrant communities. In the years since, the river has been transformed from the dumping ground that I first myself saw in 1994 to a place where thousands of volunteers have restored riverfront habitat that had long since been destroyed. And over the years, James and the Duwamish tribe and John and his neighborhood of South Park have been joined in their efforts by new waves of immigrants, by fishing families, by longshoremen, and recreational river users, among others. And at the same time, the Duwamish and other allied indigenous tribes have been undertaking a cultural revitalization of their own river traditions and their resource uses and their political leadership in the Seattle area. This has led to a growing and powerful indigenous immigrant alliance to restore the health of the Duwamish River, its watershed, and its communities. 2 years ago, Paulina Lopez, a human rights law expert originally from Ecuador who chose to live in South Park because of its proximity to the river, succeeded James as director of the Duwamish River Cleanup Coalition, now called the Duwamish River Community Coalition. And she says that her focus is on the next generation. The wealth of Seattle was built on the back of the Duwamish River, Paulina said. Sometimes I feel like we're being crushed. But then I wake up in the morning and I see our youth, how much potential they have. And when she sees that, she says, I feel like we're building a movement. I'd like to close by saying that what I've learned in the year plus that I've been talking about this book is that for many of us here in the Seattle area, we've really come to understand our treatment of our local waters as a reflection of ourselves. So for most of us, that means our treatment of the Duwamish River and its tributaries, both past and present. One of the most profound responses I've ever gotten to the question of why the Duwamish River matters was from James Rasmussen. He answered that by saying, it's like asking me why my grandmother matters. Our family shapes us, and our places mold us, and our waterways tell us something about who we are. The Duwamish River is a living reflection of Seattle's history. It's central to the character of our city. It tells us a lot about who we are and who we have been. And after spending 2 decades getting to know this river and the resiliency of both its ecosystems and its people, I think the story of the Duwamish also shows us a lot about who and what we can be. So with that, I'd like to invite a very special guest to join me before we open this up for any questions that you all have, and also to hear your thoughts about what the changes to our river and its people means to us and to our city. So please help me in welcoming James Rasmussen of the Kingdom of Colorado.
Hey.
James, you want to say a few words before we get started?
Honestly, it's almost embarrassing. My life and my family have always been important to me. I was taught at a very young age to be very proud of who I was. But don't tell anybody. Because the person who told me that was my grandfather. He'd been beaten because of who he was. And so it was that push and pull. Luckily, I was born late enough to where it was kind of cool to be Native. When I got into high school, people weren't making fun of you. Which was different from my grandfather and from my mother. My mother tells a story of, which is actually well documented. She was dating my father. They both went to Franklin High School. Any Quakers in the audience? Really? No. Really? No, I didn't think so. And as a woman knows, she knew that he was going to ask her to marry him. But before that happened, she knew she had to tell him who she was. And in the very front room of the house were all of our family's artifacts, all the native artifacts that we collected over generations. And she brings him into the room, and she shows him all that, and she says, "This is who I am. And I need you to know that." And my father looked at her and said, "That doesn't matter." And that was the next generation. There's a lot of parts to that story, but my mother and father raised me well. And most of my early life was with my grandfather, because both my mother and father worked. My father, and I was telling you this, he was a Seattle police officer. And he was part of the Seattle police drill team. The Seattle police drill team used to actually practice in this building, right here. And back in that corner was an anti-aircraft gun, was not working, but you could move it this way and that way and up and down. And so, when I wasn't watching what was going on here in the field, as it was, I was up on that, moving it one way or the other way and kind of imagining yourself shooting some bad guy down. I am blessed because of my parents. They loved me very much, and my sister, and gave us every opportunity that they did not have. As my grandfather gave my mother every opportunity that he did not have. As his mother gave him, and so on and so on. That is how we do things here, right? Do we all agree? Do we try to do better for the next generation than we have had? I really hope that that is true. Because, as you all know, things are changing. We need to rail against some of those changes that are opposite of who we are as a people. Today, this morning, and this afternoon, I was at the longhouse for the Duwamish tribe. We introduced our lawsuit against the federal government for the recognition of the Duwamish tribe. This has been a long, ongoing case, which started by a federal court judge overturning a decision by the Branch of Acknowledgement and Research, which is part of the BIA. And now we're in that final part of it. But they've had a chance to respond to us, which took years. And now we are responding to that, showing that arbitrary, unconstitutional, and absolutely against most of the laws the Bureau of Indian Affairs is supposed to uphold. This all comes from the 1870s and 1880s. That this land in the city of Seattle is too important for Indian people. And that's why the Duwamish tribe is not recognized. I've said way too much. And embarrassed by BJ already, kind of tearing up here at the front. But I also want you to understand what an important person I'm sitting next to. Because not only understanding the story, but being able to tell the story. That's important. I knew parts of it, but what she's put together is much more than just that one part. It is a lot of parts that make up the history of what made this city, the Duwamish River. This is where bowling started, people. You know, and even the 60s signs that came up, you know, on, you know, the last person that leaves Seattle, please turn out the lights. Well, that didn't happen. But we still need a basketball team. We have one. We need two. You're right. You're absolutely right. But it is with love that I'm here tonight. And what BJ does is so important. I'm retiring next month. I've worked for probably 40 years on the Duwamish. And we went through a process, and we're hiring a very, very qualified young lady who comes from Hawaii. She's already has huge environmental background in education, and she's also an attorney, or going to be an attorney. Much more qualified than I am. But as time goes, we need to leave things to younger people. Let them have their way and to push. I will always be there in the background. I will always be in support. I don't want to tell somebody what to do, but I want to be there to make sure that they understand I am supporting you. Whatever you want to do. If you're successful, good for you. If something goes wrong, it's my fault. That's kind of the way I ran DRCC when I was running it. And that's the way I intend to move forward. I want to be that kind of person who supports the people. You all need to understand how important that river is. If we are to recover orca, their main food is salmon. We have a run of wild salmon on the Green Duwamish Watershed. That's frickin' amazing. When I started over 40 years ago, well, about 40 years ago, you didn't see herons or eagles or anything like that on the Duwamish River. Today, Duwamish River has more variety of wildlife than any other place in the city of Seattle. The work has been successful. We're not recovering salmon, but we're not losing them. Keeping them at an area in the middle. Now that we know that through the current Democratic administration, that we're actually going to get a fish ladder over Howard Hanson Dam that will open up the other half of the watershed so that salmon can use it. This gives us a real opportunity to recover salmon in the watershed. And I would hope that people here support and understand why that's important. Because they are my cousins, aunties, and uncles. Just as I'm a native here, so are they. And everything I can do to help them, I will do. The river is alive. It is something in itself. Just as you and I are made up of all kinds of different things and germs in our stomachs and all kinds of things that we know of. The river is alive in that way. When I first started, I was very sick. Kind of like sitting at your grandmother's bed when she was ill. Today, she's up and walking. Hopefully we can get her even better. And that's something we can all be proud of. We created that industrial area which built this city. Can we create the balance that needs to be done? It's up to you. It's up to the people who run this place. Not this place, but this city, this county, this state. And I offer that in love to you all, because that's what I feel here. And so thank you very much for the opportunity. You asked. I'm sorry.
Absolutely. Thank you, James. Is my mic on? Yes? Okay. I think Rachel is going to invite questions. Is that right?
Yes, indeed, I am.
Mic check? All right, awesome. So, for those of you who have questions, please come up here where I am and form a line, and we will get through as many as we can. And if you have a question that you want to tell me and I can say it into the mic if you can't get up for any reason, just raise your hand and I will come to you. But we'd love to hear your questions.
And thoughts and comments.
Yeah.
Just would love to have a discussion. Yeah.
All of the above. Oh, come on. There you go.
Thank you so much. This was really, I lived here since I was 3. I've learned a whole lot. And I wanted to ask how the Superfund cleanup is going. I know that's been installed in some areas around the state, and that was
very old law. I'm just curious how that's going. I understand there's things that are good that are happening in the river, but how is that actively proceeding?
One thing everybody needs to understand, that the Superfund process takes a lot of time. It's kind of like measure 5 times and cut only once. But with all of the early action areas that we've already gone through, 5 on the Duwamish, those early action areas have cleaned up almost half of the Duwamish River. One of the largest sites was Boyne Plant 2. And originally they were only gonna take a little bit out and cover it up and everything else, and they realized, we're gonna have to monitor this forever. How much is that gonna cost? They decided it's cheaper to just take it all out, which is exactly what the community wanted. We're still working on one of those cleanup areas, which is known as Jorgensen Forge, because when they first cleaned it up, they just didn't actually clean it all up. But we are going through a plan right now with EPA to remediate that. Now EPA has worked the river into thirds. We're almost done testing the upper third of the river, starting to test the middle third, and then the lower third will come next. Just so you don't try to do everything at once. Once we get all the testing done, then that full river cleanup will start to happen, but not before. Source control is done. You're going to invest millions of dollars to clean something up. Make sure that you're not going to screw it up. And that's what's going on right now. EPA is in charge of the river cleanup. Department of Ecology is in charge of source control. And that means contaminated sites around the river, as well as stormwater that's coming into the river. And so we're on track. Sometimes it's really hard because you're putting so many different things together. City of Seattle, King County, ecology and EPA, how do you put all this together? Well, we ask that question monthly, and we're getting there. We are getting there. So understand that, yeah, somebody's watching it, and quite honestly, if something goes wrong, we'll let you know. We are not bashful in that sense. But as far as where we are in the river right now, it's so much better than it was. It is so much better than it was. But just as anybody who's done fundraising or anything else, it's that last part, it's the hardest part, right? It's always that hardest part to get done. And that's kind of sometimes where we need your help. Keep pushing, just keep pushing to make sure we really do balance a river for all.
I have 2 questions from someone in the audience. They first wanted to know, is the Longhouse open to the public, and if so, when? And the second is, did Lake Washington fall 7 feet or more?
Longhouse is open Tuesday through Saturday from 10 until I think about 5 or 6. Sometimes is closed for private events, such as the event that happened today, or like the tribal annual meeting or other things that go on. The Princess Angeline Tea, which happens, which people are more than welcome to come to. It It is on West Marginal Way. No, you can't get there by a bus. There is no bus on West Marginal Way. We just got a crosswalk across the street, from House Park, and the parking lot there and others across the street. Tribe has also purchased property, so there's another parking lot next to it, which was something that was really needed. But it is open, and I'll be honest with you, it is one of the most peaceful places that you can be. We've had this house blessed, the longhouse itself. And we know our spirits are so happy about it being there. And just to be there and to sit down and to just be there is important. So if you haven't, shame on you. If you have, go back. There's always new things to see and to understand. They have a brand new display there that is wonderful. There was another question there, wasn't there?
Exactly how much the river dropped, and all of the planning and engineering documents that I've looked at, I'll say it's at least 7 feet. Some indicate that it was a little bit more in the end. Probably also depends a little bit where on the lakes you're talking about. What was really significant is that it dropped enough to drop below the outlet to Black River, which the engineers knew, but for the most part, the Duwamish tribal members that depended on the Black did not before that happened. So I don't know if that satisfactorily answers your question, but I guess it depends what engineering document you're looking at.
The other part of that, which I will, because I'm born and raised in that neighborhood, Lake Washington Boulevard, as you drive along the lake, that's the old drop-off. So if you think of it as 7 feet, quite honestly, probably it was more than that. Because when you look at the older houses, they're much higher up than where you see a lot of the newer houses that are right on the boulevard.
The level of the lake also, varies year to year to a certain extent. So
It
I don't know
varies.
if there's a one perfect answer to exactly 7 feet, how many inches.
Could either or both of you address the changes, not at the Duwamish, but further upriver once it becomes the green? And you mentioned the building of the dam. I remember that almost every year the Green River would flood, just like the Snoqualmie Valley floods to this day. Did the changes, and then because it didn't flood any longer, that led to incredible changes in the land use and what was there. Has that created a problem that, okay, we're cleaning up the Duwamish and the industrial pollution there, but what about all the commercial and other stuff that's being thrown in further upriver that now is coming down? And similar, was there any kind of thing like the Nile where the flooding was efficacious to the river, that it flushed the river out, that it provided nutrients coming from higher up to lower down in the valley? So could you talk a little bit about those changes historically and hydrologically, I guess, too?
Sure. I can give a brief answer. Yes, the Green River, flooded just as the White did. I talked a little bit more about the White, but you can look at the story of each of the branches of the river and the very specific changes that took place on each one. And the flooding on the Green was also really extraordinary, and would still be today. It used to flood regularly before Howard Hanson Dam was put in. It continued to flood after Howard Hanson was put in. It continues to flood today. But Howard Hanson Dam certainly has a a mitigating impact on the floods, but also, a debilitating impact on salmon runs, a debilitating impact on flushing those, nutrients from the upper watershed down, which is where our cleanest sediments are, and certainly, we could use a little bit of that in the lower part of the river. I know there were quite several parts to your question, but James is also familiar with some of the work going on in the green, and there's a lot more discussion of the green in the river near Seattle as well. Sometime, maybe one day I'll do a 4-hour talk that covers all of the branches equally, but. Want to add anything?
Sure. We're in the middle of, obviously, the cleanup of the Duwamish River. Part of that is what's called the pollutant loading assessment. That's EPA and ecology project. And what that's looking at, the whole watershed. And they're putting a model together. Don't ask me how they do that. But they're putting a model together to really realize, all of, what's cement, what's not, and what are roads, and what are the loading things that are going into the watershed. And then taking that put together, and then being able to actually understand what are some of the places where we have the best effect from what's coming down from the upper watershed, so that we can actually improve what's coming down the watershed. So that's something that's in process already right now. And it will continue to the point where, the way I look at it, low-hanging fruit. What can be cleaned up that will have the best effect? And that's where we are. We're thinking about those things right now. And so, the original estimate of what pollution was coming down the river was way overblown because responsible parties, I don't want to get into this too much, didn't want to clean up the river. And there were other people who were the agencies that said, that's not true. And so studies were done, and it wasn't. Where we are today is that we're never going to get to the way the river was in the 1800s. Us at DRCC understand that, the communities understand that. How close can we come? That's really the issue right now. How close can we come? PCBs, cancer-causing chemicals. 2 parts per billion. That's a natural background level. This is not a natural chemical, okay? But you can go to the top of Mount Everest and you'll find PCBs. That's why that's the natural background level. Meaning, hey, we can get to 7, we can get to 5. How many more meals a month does that mean that somebody who's fishing in the Duwamish River doesn't have to worry about their health? That's the point. How close can we get?
Thank you. I want to give a big round of applause to both BJ Cummings and James Rasmussen for being here with us tonight. As well as a big round of applause for all of you for coming out. Thank you. Yes, you can applaud for yourself. And thank you to our captioner and to our ASL interpreters. We're very excited to have you here. So if you enjoyed tonight and you want to learn more, we do have copies of
BJ's book, The River That Made Seattle, available at the MOHAI Mercantile. And she will be staying around for a book signing too, if you brought a copy or would like to purchase one and get it signed. Also, when you arrived, you should have gotten a slip of paper with a QR code. That has a survey. We would love to keep bringing you the best in regional history programs, and to do that, we need your feedback. If you do not want to do it through a QR code, we also have paper copies of the survey and pencils at the front desk, so just go visit the front desk and we can give those to you as well. There's a prize raffle, and it only takes 5 minutes, so please, please help us out. If you want more history programming, you can come back next week. We're going to be doing a History Cafe lecture at 6:30 in the Lakefront Pavilion behind you next Wednesday, and it's on the democratizing power of radio. Almost finally, we're excited to announce that we have some new exhibits opening on May 28th. Ansel Adams' Masterworks and Perspectives on Placed Photographs from Here. And so thinking about nature and humans' connections to nature will be key themes of those, so please come back in just a few short weeks. And finally, if you learned something new or enjoy the work that we do, please consider making a gift or becoming a member to support future programs and help sustain the museum. Thank you so much. Have a lovely rest of your evening and safe travels.